John McWhorter, welcome to the Glenn Show.
Glenn Loury, thank you for having me back as always.
Very good to be talking with you, John. Very good to be talking. It's Christmas.
You too. That's
John,
right.
what's new in the blogosphere that's worth talking about on bloggingheads.tv and that is appropriate to the season?
Well, I'll tell you, actually, this morning it occurred to me that there seems to be kind of a kerfuffle over this set to between Fox News' Megyn Kelly and the punditocracy over her having asserted that, yes, Santa Claus is white. And this is in response to a piece that I called your attention to on Slate, written by Aisha Harris a little time ago. She was taking issue with the fact that Santa Claus in her house was depicted as black, but she couldn't help noticing that out in the rest of the world, Santa Claus was white, and that you couldn't help thinking as a black child that that was the real Santa Claus. And so she suggests that to be modern, we recast Santa Claus as a penguin. And this is what sparked Megyn Kelly's response on Fox News, saying that no, in fact, Santa Claus is white.
So we have a fight over the racial identity of Santa Claus.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem that is going to occupy us on this 30 minutes or whatever of Blogging Heads conversation. Can this really be important?
Well, I think it's certainly not worth 30 minutes. But here, I wanted to ask you something about this, which is that, I always thought Santa Claus was white. That seemed to be the way he was created. And all the pictures, he was white. And when I was a kid, you would see in the 70s, you would see black Santa Clauses drawn here and there. But it always seemed to me that it was unlikely that somebody of that ethnicity would be living up near the North Pole. And it just seemed to me that this Santa person, even, and I think we can say this on Blogging Heads, even when I thought that he existed, which I think was until I was about 8, I always assumed that he was white. And it didn't bother me. And I would think that somebody would be even less bothered by it today. But apparently some people feel different. How did you process Santa Claus? And do you think it's a problem that this emblematic character is white instead of multi-ethnic or racially indeterminate like Vin Diesel or a penguin or something like that?
Okay, I will respond to that question even though I think it's beneath me. No, just kidding. I don't mean that for you. I mean,
I know what you mean.
The fact that this is something we're talking about. I grew up in the 1950s, man. That's when I was 8 years old. Okay, I was 8 years old in 1956, 1957. And believe me, Santa Claus was white, and I don't even
No black Santa at all.
There weren't any black Santas in 1957. The question, of course, is what color is Jesus? Okay. I mean, if you wanted to make this a serious conversation, we could talk about the blonde or light sandy brown-haired, blue-eyed Jesus images that we could find in so many African-American homes.
And Megyn Kelly touched on Jesus, too. Yeah, that's right.
Chances are Jesus was more Asiatic than he was Nordic, right? I mean,
that's right.
This was Palestine, after all. Chances are he didn't have blonde hair, and he probably didn't have blue eyes, and he probably had a rather swarthy complexion, all things
Jesus
considered.
Would have looked kind of like a Bedouin. Yeah, that's what he would have
something,
looked
like. If we had to guess about his color. But what do I think about this whole thing? So I think that the instinct is to say political correct poppycock. I mean, give me a break, okay? But then I remembered how much significance some people attach to the fact that Barack Obama, President of the United States, was a man with brown skin. Then I remembered how they told me, at least many progressives told me, how fundamentally significant this was for the self-identity of people of color in the country. Anything was possible for them. And then I started thinking, having had that inspiration, maybe the color of Santa Claus, the color of Jesus, maybe the way that we depict these subjects in our culture really does exert some kind of insidious influence on the confidence and sense of worth that people of color have. But then, John, I recalled that I thought it was hokum to assert that the color of the President of the United States was going to do anything for a kid living in a housing project with a cold water walk-up flat somewhere, with a father not at home and a mother just barely hanging on, and going to a school that where he doesn't learn anything and having to fit in with street gangs. I thought the idea that the color of the president of the United States really had nothing to do with his life. I remembered that thought. And I realized that the logical implication would be that arguing about whether or not Santa Claus, okay, so this is the birth of Jesus that we're celebrating, and this is the secularized symbolism that has grown up around it, where we allow for the holiday spirit to be decoupled from its religious inspiration, and we inherit these St. Nicholas-like characters and these Dickensian fairy tales and all this kind of stuff. And I realized, much ado about nothing. Anyway, long-winded way of me saying I can hardly get moved. What is much more interesting to me is the reaction, as you say. Much more interesting to me that Megyn Kelly finds it necessary to defend the honor of white people by reminding her audience not to be concerned. Santa is still white, okay? This investment in whiteness and the property entitlements of whiteness, the cultural authority of whiteness, and the need to defend it against the multicultural barbarians at the gate, that strikes me as much more interesting.
It seems to me that you're giving Megyn Kelly a lot of credit for defending the privileges of whiteness in her statement. I think she may have been making a more basic statement that that character, created largely by Scandinavian myths and by Thomas Nast, the cartoonist, the person they created was Caucasian. And I think that
well, that's correct as a historian.
Many of us are inclined to think that we're supposed to read some larger meaning into it. But I'd be interested to see what kind of psychological test could reveal that what she's doing deep down is saying, no, Santa Claus is we white people's and not theirs. What I find from this, if we're going to read motivations into it, is I don't know Aisha Harris. I don't really know what she does. But when I read her piece, quickly at first, because I didn't know it was going to become such, as they put it, a thing, I was thinking, it seems to me that we're talking about a little girl who grows up, who is uncomfortable with the idea of a fat, jolly white man coming into her house and giving out presents. Like, her idea is that the person who does that better be a brother, better be somebody who she's really comfortable with, because white people are alternate. And that you're going to feel that way even on Christmas. And, to the extent that this matters, I find myself thinking, if we're going to get past race at all, then the idea that you don't want that white man in your house giving out the presents, and really it would be better if he was black, is not exactly progressive. And I understand what people mean when they say that we're not past race and that black people have a reason to fear white people and not to want them in their most intimate settings. But to institutionalize that idea by even proposing making Santa into a penguin, which is something that she couldn't possibly mean. That was just something she had to have as a second half to the column. It just seems like it's perpetrating and almost studiously putting up this certain sense of the white person as alien, which strikes me as not a constructive way of dealing with a world where white people are going to run it for the time being. I never needed Santa to be black.
I think we're overthinking this one, John. I mean, I think...
Probably.
I don't disagree with anything that you just said. I mean, give me a break. I mean, lighten up. I mean, come on. Do we have to be black 24/7, 365? Am I really defined by the color of my skin? I mean, give me a break. We live on the planet Earth. There are many billions of people. They come in all kinds of colors. Culture is interesting. Syncretism is interesting, where you adapt and adopt symbols and meanings from different cultures in a polyglot and pluralistic social setting in which all different kinds of people exist. So, the hip-hop artist is probably black. Can a white person be a hip-hop artist? Certainly a white person can. Do white people live in need of the existence of a Eminem in order to feel reassured about their coolness so that they don't grow up thinking that white and square are synonymous with one another? I hardly think so, not unless they're racially obsessed. Likewise, do black children need a brown-colored Santa Claus in a world of a billion symbols? And as I say, the most important one of this season is Jesus the Christ. Do they need a brown-colored Santa Claus in order to feel okay with themselves? Only in a sick environment in which parents teach their children that their self-worth is to be measured each and every day by the correspondence between the color of their skin and the color of whatever it is that they're looking at on television. So to my mind, Aisha Harris is not, I mean, I don't think she's morally mistaken. I saw some of the comments people were calling, you weren't, but people were calling her a racist. But I think it's a silly argument, vacuous argument. And I don't have time for it. I mean, race is actually important for various reasons in the United States, like the composition of our prisons, for example, or the character of poverty, or the inequality of educational opportunity that exists in this country, and so forth and so on. But it's not important for the psychological damage done by the St. Nicholas a cultural artifact. I mean, there was a St. Nicholas as a matter of historical fact. There is this tradition within the Euro-American cultural Christmas celebrating nexus of this guy with the reindeer and the sled and the gifts coming down the chimney and all of that. It is what it is, and it's not about you, Aisha Harris.
You know, Glenn, let me ask you something. I know you want to get off of this, but it reminds me of something that I've never written about, and I'm going by the seat of my pants here. Aisha Harris's piece strikes me as coming from someone who might do something that I saw last Christmas. A very old friend of mine who is Black American sent a Christmas card. And her children are adorable, and she had photographs of the kids. But what was interesting about the kids, these young black kids, I would put them at 7, 8, boy and a girl, not smiling. She has these photographs of them, and they're just looking right at you. No smile at all. And it struck me, because usually when you have those Sears pictures, you get a smile. You're supposed to. Now, maybe one of your kids was having a bad day or something, but not both of them. You know, she chose pictures of both of them looking very serious. And from knowing her, and it's a guess, I would never discuss it with her, and I don't really know her anymore, but I think that what she is thinking, and it might even be subconscious, is that she wants her kids to be serious black people. And that even at 7 and 8, the default shot of them is not supposed to be them grinning out into this world that's going to show them what color they are very soon. They're going to be serious kids ready to take anything, and so they're going to look into that camera in that department store, and they're going to look serious, glum. And I can't imagine white parents putting out pictures of their kids not smiling in that way. It almost looked like the kids were posing as rappers or something, you know, the way rappers aren't supposed to smile in their pictures. Am I reading too much into those shots? Can you imagine white parents having pictures of little Caitlin and Timmy where they're just kind of glowering into the camera instead of smiling? And I think that's where Aisha Harris is coming from, that black children need to be aware that the world is going to kick them in the teeth for their race, and they ought to be ready. And I'm not sure if that gesture is necessary in 2013 is my problem. I wouldn't call her silly, but I think that there's a defensiveness that has maybe lived past its usefulness. But then again, somebody like her would tell me I'm not thinking about Trayvon Martin. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean, and I know especially what you mean by that last comment, because that would be the rebuttal to all of my rant that culminated in the silliness charge. Mm-hmm. And I see what you mean, and I find your observation very interesting. John, you ought to think about writing a novel one of these days, because I could see the scene in which you have your character looking at a photograph. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is the adult looking back on their own childhood. Their family is being depicted in the photograph, and they notice that they're not smiling. That is, as kids, he and his sister are not smiling. And they then do exactly the disposition that you rendered on the non-smile, on the glower, on the seriousness. Our mother chose to have us photographed in that way. She did that. Why? We were black in 2013 in America. They said it was the post-civil rights era, the post-racial era, but as a matter of fact, it was not. And indeed, that choice, which might seem trivial and incidental, has embedded within it so much cultural content and so much political significance, because we had to live in a world in which we had our guard up. My mother had to raise her kids, blah, 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 and you could go on in that way. And I think that that would be very interesting in terms of character development. And I do kind of I do kind of see that, but I think it's a mistake. I mean, in other words, I think we are past it, as you say, as a sociological matter. That is, if you just ask the question, do the constraints of race so bind that a black person can never relax in 2013 or ought not to be raised so as to relax and forget about being black in 2023 when they're an adult? I would say, yes, the world has changed enough that you can chill out on that. Mm-hmm. But the cultivated practice of having one's guard up, the almost cherished bearing of this burden of being black in a white man's world might be something that a person gets accustomed to and doesn't want to let go of long after the time in which it has perhaps outlived its usefulness. I mean, the idea that we live in a world in which when I walk into a department store to shop, I have to worry that I'm going to be racially profiled by the store detective. Mm-hmm. That we live in a world in which when I step from my doorstep onto the city street, I have to worry that I'm going to be shot dead by a cop who mistakes me for a burglar. Or that we live in a world in which I really have to guard my children's psyche against the corrupting influence of a Nordic-looking St. Nicholas. Mm-hmm. Come on. I mean, you really need to let go. And oh, by the way, that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. People who walk around with chips on their shoulder draw attention to themselves.
Mm-hmm. It'd be interesting to do psychological testing on that, as a matter of fact. But you know what's interesting about what you're saying is that you are depicting the psychology of a great many very intelligent black people today. Many of them would really say exactly what you're saying. And my feeling is everything they're talking about is true, but not to enough of an extent to justify a physical or an emotional posture. All those things happen, including the profiling, but not so much that it becomes who you are and your public face and telling your children not to smile for the camera, et cetera, et cetera. I just don't feel it. And I think one of the hardest things is that for many people, for you or I to say that is threatening, that you and I become contemptible. You know, first they think that we must be naive, and then when it turns out that we're not, then I think they often think that we somehow think we're better than them. And I really don't. If anything, I'm just perplexed, and it just kind of sits there. But I wish that the dialogue were not such that what you just said will elicit a click of the tongue from many people. The idea that there's something you don't get. Because I don't think you don't get anything.
Well, thank you. Neither do I think that I don't get what they're talking. I mean, look, I've been racially profiled, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Here's what I'm saying. I'm saying that as African Americans, for what it's worth, okay, we got a choice, okay? This is a little bit like, Bill Clinton, Nelson Mandela died recently. Bill Clinton has remembered famously these last few days, it's been 10 days or so since Mandela's death. He's remembered famously how Mandela counseled him during the Monica Lewinsky scandal period when he and Mandela met. And Mandela basically said, don't let them. He said, when I was in prison, they took away everything that, they could take from me. They seemed to take away everything, but they couldn't take my mind. They couldn't take my heart. They couldn't take my spirit. Mm-hmm. Don't let them take it. Don't let them take it. Okay. Mm-hmm. That was his advice to Clinton against his political enemies and all of that. The analogy is strained, to be sure. Mandela in jail, Clinton with Monica Lewinsky. But in any case, the point is, don't let them have your soul. Okay. Mm-hmm. If I live 24/7, 365, pondering what somebody else is thinking about me because of the color of their skin, even though on occasion they will be so thinking, mm-hmm. I'm giving them way too much headroom, way too much. You know what I mean? When I walk into a restaurant and the maitre d' sits me by the kitchen, I politely ask for another table. I don't spend 10 seconds worrying about what might be true, which is that I'm black, and he thought it was okay to put me at the least desirable table in the dining room. Mm-hmm. If I allow that thought to gain a foothold, I'll never be able to go to a restaurant without having my blood pressure rise. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to give him that much space.
And it seems to me that part of the reason why you and I are in bad odor among a lot of black people is
Speak for yourself, John.
Okay, I'll say the reason I'm in bad odor is because I feel the same way, that would be giving in. It seems to me that it's a matter of black pride. And yet for so many people, the idea seems to be that we're supposed to give in to that. and define the most interesting thing about being black to be being subject to those things. And as you say, it's a matter of possibly being subject to those things, and often so seldom that many outsiders would be perplexed that you would think of it as a defining aspect of your existence. And so I look at the others and I say, why would you want to let them get you? But then they look at me, or if I may say us, and they say that we don't like ourselves. And then it just kind of goes round and round in circles. And then if we say that we do like ourselves, we're called arrogant. And you really just can't seem to win. And so it's a tough one because, yeah, you're giving in if you walk around thinking 24/7 about things that might be, even though sometimes they are, sure. But it gets to a point where the sometimes is so some that there's a question as to whether it makes sense for human beings to fashion their whole identity around it. I think we agree on this. But I want to ask you about those photographs.
I want to mention one thing here. I read, for a course I taught last semester, a book by the Nobel economist Amartya Sen.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not about economics. The book is called Identity and Violence, The Illusion of Destiny.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So, long story short, Sen starts out in post-independence subcontinent of India, where Pakistan and India are coming into being as nations, and where Muslim and Hindu are amidst great communal violence, separating populations and going into these two countries. And there's a lot of violence. And he says, this violence is only possible when people labor under the illusion that their ethnicity or their religion defines their humanity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the illusion of destiny, that being born a Hindu determines, or a Muslim determines my destiny. It is mainly who I am. Sen goes on to observe that we are, in our humanity, a great many things. We may be Christians or Muslims or Jews. We may be black or white. We may be gay or straight. We may be intellectuals or laborers. We may be peaceniks or hawks, and so on. Okay? And that when we grasp the full complexity of our human condition, we are less likely to be driven to acts of madness on behalf of one sliver of our humanity. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Hacking somebody to death because you're a Tutsi and they're a Hutu in a communal enactment of such slaughter is madness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? It is certainly not an expression of our humanity, or at least not of the most noble dimensions of it. We can transcend these things. We don't have to be bound by this. I mean, please, that's why I say silly. Okay, if not silly, then immature, undeveloped, unreflective, not very deep or profound. I don't want to live on the surface of life. Worrying about the color of my skin in correspondence to the color of an image on television is not a very deep way of living. And certainly raising one's children to have such a orientation seems to me to do them a grave disservice.
Glenn, the damnedest thing is that everything you're saying, I think, makes perfect sense and would make perfect sense to anybody. But I think we both know that there's a certain kind of person who would raise their hand and say, Trayvon Martin, still, that because of what happened to him, or the person who gets pulled over in the store suspected of not having the money to pay for something, and you read about these things, and they happen, that because of those things, we can't afford to just think of ourselves as individuals, that yes, the blackness does define our existence. And, there's a complete contradiction there, because, it could be Ellis Coase, formerly of Newsweek, who I think would be the kind of person who would say that. He's the person who wrote The Roots of Middle-Class Black Rage.
Yeah, the rage of a privileged class.
That's right. Yeah. And he would say that, no, these things are defining. Now, on the one hand, I'm sure that Ellis Coase would sit and nod at the things you said, which are things that Ralph Ellison said, that were things that James Weldon Johnson used to say, that Frederick Douglass would have said. He'll nod. But then on the other hand, when you say Trayvon Martin, he'll nod again. And for him, what you said is a luxury that we black Americans can't afford, because particularly of our relationship with police forces. And I just don't think that, especially outside of certain communities, that sense of what it means to be black and for there to be police makes sense as a life experience. And yet even on my own campus, there are many people who would say that was a highly irresponsible thing to say in public. And we're just stuck here, unfortunately. It's it really is.
I gotta say this, man. I gotta say, I think although the subject is frivolous and some of our listeners may have already tuned out, come on, you gotta be kidding me. You're talking about what color is Santa Claus? The subject seems frivolous, but this argument or discussion that we're having right now, I think is really very important. And it reminds me of something. You mentioned Ellison and James Weldon Johnson. And I wonder if, in a way, we haven't become less adept as African Americans at dealing with the mind-twisting complexity of race in America. If we haven't become less deep and less profound and less wise in this. Okay, I'm thinking about the literary career of James Baldwin, of the great James Baldwin. Okay, I remember this early essay of his, Everybody's Protest novel, in which he reviews Richard Wright's Native Son.
I've read it, yeah.
And in the context of Harriet Beecher Snow's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, and Everybody's Protest novel. So these two novels, one Harriet Beecher Snow and one of the 19th century and one Richard Wright of the 20th century about race, have in common their quality as protest novels, and that is to say, novels in which the narrative is in the service of voicing this sense of outrage and moral affront at the implacability of, in the case of Stowe, slavery and what it did to reducing African Americans to a subhuman status, and in the case of Richard Wright, the Chicago ghetto of the 1930s and the whole post-World War I Depression era. Jim Crow. Okay, exactly. And Baldwin's point, I'll try to make this brief, in that essay, in that profound essay, in my opinion, was, gee, this is a disservice to literature, because our human existence is really much more complex than the fact that we've been reduced to victimhood. We have been victimized, but we haven't been reduced in our humanity to two-dimensional reactive figures because of that victimization. Indeed, we are still responsible moral agents, and our imperative is to live. Okay, this is Baldwin. Okay, so I loved that. I love that. By the end of his career, James Baldwin could write a nonfiction tract called The Evidence of Things Not Seen, which was a report on the child killings in Atlanta, Georgia, in which an African-American man, whose name I can't recall now, was finally arrested and convicted of the abduction and murders.
Wayne Williams. Right?
Indeed, that was his name. You got it, John.
Yeah,
Wayne Williams was finally, and it grew up in the folk culture, the kind of urban legend of African Americans that he really hadn't done it. He had been framed, and that it was really a conspiracy of Ku Klux Klan affiliated Atlanta area police officers who were abducting these young black men. And Baldwin went on to speculate and cutting off their penises in order to try to harvest some kind of virility-enhancing drug that was thought to, et cetera, et cetera.
I missed that part. Okay,
I mean, and if I err in attributing this to Baldwin, please forgive me. But my point is, by the end of his career, he was trafficking in the very kind of less than fully humanistically excellent writing in reaction to the plight and the condition of African Americans.
And you know what that was? And Baldwin is interesting in that way because Baldwin found that he got a certain kind of reception. I mean, God bless James Baldwin, but he got a certain kind of reception from taking that kind of line as the times changed. And there was a part of him, as there is in any famous literature like him, that just liked the attention and liked the praise. And I'm not going to say the money because it wasn't that with him, but he liked to be liked. And so he fell in with that way of looking at things. There was one little kink of Baldwin's as he tended to make it sound as if he was more on the front lines of civil rights protests in the physical sense than he really was. He wanted to be part of what was seen as urgent and goodly. And I think what you're touching on is something very simple, which is that it's not an accident that someone like early James Baldwin or somebody like Ralph Ellison would say, we're human beings too, at a time when a black man could barely hope to be a lawyer outside of a black firm, couldn't try on clothes at Sears. And now, here we are in these times when I don't even need to specify how much A, B, and C have changed.
Indeed.
And you have people who are saying that, no, our whole humanity is defined by the fact that somebody might ask us for extra ID when we're trying to buy something at the store, etc. And I think it's because there's a luxury. We have the luxury of obsessing with certain inconveniences because the truth is that we do have now so much freedom in our lives. If things were as bad, and I've written this in some places, if things were as bad as a lot of us are told to think, then we couldn't afford to stress the negative in that way. And that's why I think a modern person today will both nod reading Ralph Ellison and celebrate him as some sort of prophet and seer, which he very much was. But then on the other hand, we'll read somebody like Ellis Coase or Aisha Harris and say, yes, we must be defined by this sense of our being eternally victimized, even if only in abstract ways, by the white hegemony. It's because things are so much better that we can kind of nip our tongues at that loose tooth and kind of obsess with the little pinpricks of pain. And it worries me because that obsessing with the pain is a kind of self-denigration, as you're saying. And it always just reminds me how good we have it, because if we're really so bad, we couldn't afford to magnify the effects of things like that.
I think you're making an excellent point. An excellent point, John. It's an Orlando Pattersonian point, actually.
He would say that.
Yeah. You know, his book, The Ordeal of Integration.
His best one, yeah.
Right. I mean, that is the lifting of the oppressor's boot off of your neck, of course, is in the first instance a blessing. It's good to have the boot off of your neck. Mm-hmm. But it also confronts one with a variety of different challenges and dilemmas, and there are pitfalls in that. That one can fall into, and I think you're characterizing one of them. I just want to say one final thing, and then I think we need to go. At least I need to go to the next thing, and we can pick this up another time. Mm-hmm. And that is there is a flip side to the salve of wearing that loose tooth. Okay, that is, on the one hand, it may feel good to worry that loose tooth, which is to say, to continue to obsess about this annoying, continuing remnant of what had at one time been a much more repressive system. But there's a flip side to it, okay? If you are not willing to let go of race, that is to say, you, the African American, you, the person of color, in the smallest recesses of your mind, how can you expect to cultivate the social habit of letting go of race when it might really matter? That is, if I want to say, you know what, most of the robberies committed in and around this gated community were committed by African American teenagers, as a matter of objective fact. But the vast majority of African American teenagers are of no threat to you. And it really is uncivil in the extreme to treat every African American teenager you see as if he were a representative of this class of persons who have a higher robbery rate as a matter of objective criminal statistic. Okay, so I'm inviting you, as a matter of civility, to disattend the relatively insignificant racial correlation in the statistic.
Right.
But I'm unwilling to disattend the relatively insignificant cultural residue of a history of white domination and superiority. I mean, if I really want people to not notice Trayvon Martin's being a black teenager and treat him differently because of that, don't I need to, not that there's a causal connection between the two, but just as a fact of having one's head in the right space and being on the right page about what you're trying to do in society, don't I have to loosen up a little bit?
And I think we can say in closing that there's a certain kind of person who would say, I hear what you're saying, you have a point, there's some of that, oh, of course, but, and then what they would have to say is, all he had was a soda, some juice, and some Skittles, and he was wearing a hoodie,
and he paid with his life.
And for them, that's the period at the end of the sentence.
All right, John, we've done it again. We've managed to piss off the multitudes. The black guys at Blogging Head TV who just won't be black enough.
This isn't even what we were supposed to be talking about, but I think this was a valuable conversation. And I think it went way beyond Santa Claus. And I really felt it, and I know you did too.
I did, John. Thanks a lot, man. We'll talk again soon.
Have a fun meeting.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.